January 17, 1945, Western Pacific Ocean. 0347 hours. The sea was black glass beneath a moonless sky. Somewhere in the cold, heaving waters southeast of Formosa, Lieutenant Commander Nakamura Hideaki stood on the cramped bridge of the I-58, his hands gripping the cold steel railing as salt spray needled his face. The submarine's diesels thrummed beneath his feet, a sound he'd grown to love during 3 years of war, a sound that meant power, meant purpose, meant the Emperor's will cutting through enemy waters. But tonight, that familiar vibration felt different, tighter, more desperate. Around him, young sailors moved with mechanical precision, their faces gaunt in the red battle lighting, eyes ringed with sleeplessness that went beyond mere fatigue. They were starving. Not just for food, though their rations had been cut again last week, but for something more fundamental. They were starving for victory. 3 years earlier, Nakamura had stood on a different deck, watching Pearl Harbor burn from the submarine I-26 as black smoke wrote Japan's dominance across the Hawaiian sky. He remembered the euphoria, the certainty that flooded through every man aboard, the absolute conviction that they had crippled the American beast before it could wake. The planning had been flawless, the execution divine. Japan's long-lance torpedoes, the Type 93s that could strike from nearly 20,000 meters with devastating accuracy, had been the terror of the Pacific. Oxygen-fueled, wakeless, unstoppable. American torpedoes, by contrast, had been a joke. A bitter, tragic joke that the Imperial Navy's intelligence officers recounted with barely concealed glee in the officers' mess. The American Mark the 14th torpedo, a weapon so fundamentally broken that it seemed designed by saboteurs rather than engineers. Nakamura had read the intercepts himself. American submarine commanders, furious and demoralized, filing report after report of torpedoes that ran too deep, detonators that failed on impact, magnetic exploders that triggered prematurely or not at all. There were documented cases of American submarines firing entire spreads, 6, 8, 10 torpedoes, at stationary Japanese transports, only to watch every single weapon either pass harmlessly beneath the target or strike with a dull, impotent clang that left the enemy ship completely intact. It had been more than mechanical failure, it had been systematic collapse. The United States Navy had entered the war with a primary weapon that simply did not work. For Japanese submariners and surface commanders alike, this American incompetence had been a gift from the gods. It meant that even when American submarines achieved perfect firing positions, stalking Japanese carriers and battleships with patient skill, the moment of attack became a moment of humiliation rather than triumph. Nakamura remembered the intelligence briefing in mid-1942 when a staff officer had displayed photographs of an American torpedo that had struck the Yahagi but failed to detonate, bouncing off the destroyer's hull like a child's toy. The room had erupted in laughter, not cruel laughter, but the genuine mirth of men who recognized they were fighting an enemy hobbled by its own technological arrogance. But standing on the bridge of the I-58 in January 1945, with the war grinding into its 4th year, Nakamura understood that something had changed, something profound and terrifying. The Americans, it seemed, had finally fixed their torpedoes. The realization had come gradually, like dawn bleeding into a long night. First, there had been whispers from returning convoy escorts, stories of American submarines that had begun hitting their targets with disturbing consistency. Then came the casualty reports. Transport ships, once relatively safe from American subsurface attacks, were vanishing at an accelerating rate. Tankers carrying precious fuel from the southern resource area were exploding mid-voyage, their crews lost in columns of fire that no longer seemed like bad luck, but rather like precise execution. By late 1944, the Imperial Navy's shipping losses had become catastrophic. Submarines bearing names Nakamura had memorized during training. Tang, Flasher, Barb, Archerfish were carving through Japan's maritime lifelines with a lethality that suggested not just improved weapons but a fundamental shift in the war's momentum, the most devastating. Confirmation had come just 2 months earlier. November 29, 1944. The supercarrier Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, supposedly unsinkable, had been struck by 4 American torpedoes fired by the submarine Archerfish. 4 torpedoes, 4 hits. The Shinano had gone down in 7 hours, taking with her over 1,000 men and the myth of Japanese naval invulnerability. Nakamura had been in port when the news arrived. He watched senior officers, men who had commanded cruisers at Midway and destroyers in the Java Sea, sit in stunned silence as the implications crystallized. The Americans had not merely fixed their torpedoes, they had perfected them. And now, with that weapon finally functioning as intended, the industrial colossus that Japan had awakened was turning its full, terrible attention to methodically destroying everything that floated under the rising sun flag. What the Japanese Navy had failed to fully appreciate, what Nakamura himself was only beginning to understand in those cold January hours, was not just that. American torpedoes now worked. It was the systematic, almost scientific manner in which American submariners were applying their newfound lethality. This was not the desperate improvisational warfare of 1942 and 1943. This was industrial-scale maritime strangulation, executed with the precision of a factory assembly line. The transformation of the American Mark XIII torpedo had been neither quick nor simple. It had required American submarine commanders to essentially mutiny against their own ordnance bureaus, to conduct unauthorized field modifications, to risk their careers by publicly challenging the weapons experts who insisted, against all evidence, that the torpedoes were functioning perfectly. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines in the Pacific, had finally ordered live fire tests in 1943 that definitively proved the magnetic exploders were worthless and the contact exploders were fundamentally flawed. The modifications that followed, deactivating the magnetic feature, strengthening the firing pins, correcting the depth-keeping mechanism, had been embarrassingly simple. But the psychological damage to American submarine crews had been profound. For nearly 2 years, they had risked their lives achieving perfect attack positions, only to watch their weapons fail again and again. Now, in 1945, those same crews were hunting with weapons that functioned exactly as designed. The Mark XIII, once a tragic joke, had become a reliable instrument of destruction. More importantly, the Americans had introduced the Mark XVI electric torpedo, a weapon similar to Japan's own Type 92, but produced in staggering quantities that only American industry could achieve. Weightless, reliable, and deadly, these torpedoes were being loaded into American submarines by the thousands. And the submarines themselves were being produced at a rate that seemed to defy logic. The United States was launching more submarines in a single month than Japan could build in a year. Each one carried 24 torpedoes. Each one was hunting. Nakamura's own patrol had been a study in frustration and fear. His mission was to intercept American supply convoys moving between the Philippines and Formosa, convoys that were sustaining MacArthur's advance through the islands. But the hunters had become the hunted. Twice in the past week, American submarines had nearly bracketed the I-58. The first time, Nakamura had crash-dived to 300 feet and endured 6 hours of silent running while destroyers prowled overhead. The second time, he'd heard the distinctive whine of electric torpedoes passing overhead. The Americans had evidently overestimated his depth, and the weapons had run 10 meters too shallow. But they had been close, terrifyingly close, and they had not malfunctioned. The contrast with Japan's own deteriorating situation was stark. The I-58 was operating on reduced rations because the supply ships that should have replenished her stores had been sunk by American submarines. Her diesel fuel was contaminated with impurities because the refineries in the southern resource area were either destroyed or cut off. 3 of her 6 torpedo tubes had mechanical problems that the ship's artificers lacked the parts to properly repair. And even when the torpedoes functioned correctly, there were increasingly few targets worth the expenditure. The American convoys moved under such heavy escort, destroyers, equipped with radar and sonar far superior to Japanese equipment, that approaching within attack range had become nearly suicidal. What gnawed at Nakamura most deeply was the sense that Japanese tactical excellence, the superior training, the warrior spirit, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the emperor no longer mattered. The Americans had turned the Pacific War into an industrial equation, and in equations of industrial production, Japan could not compete. Every Japanese submarine lost was irreplaceable. Every experienced crew that went down represented years of training that could not be replicated. Meanwhile, American submarines seemed to multiply like living organisms. For every one sunk, and the Americans were losing submarines, Japanese anti-submarine forces were not completely ineffective, 2 more appeared. And now, finally, every one of those submarines carried torpedoes that worked. The symbolic weight of this reversal was crushing. The torpedo, that most fundamental weapon of submarine warfare, had become a mirror reflecting the broader trajectory of the war. In 1941, Japan had possessed the world's finest torpedoes, and the Americans had fielded weapons that embarrassed their own navy. By 1945, American torpedoes were reliable, mass-produced, and devastating, while Japanese weapons suffered from the same resource shortages and quality control failures that plagued every aspect of the empire's war industry. It was not just a technical correction. It was a manifestation of 2 completely different approaches to industrial warfare. Japan had entered the war with exquisite weapons produced by craftsmen, torpedoes that represented the apex of pre-war engineering, each one carefully manufactured, each one a small masterpiece of precision. But there were never enough. Production could not scale. When magnetic influence pistols failed, there were no resources to develop alternatives. When oxygen-fueled long lances became too complex to maintain aboard submarines operating for months at sea, there were no simpler backup weapons. Excellence had been achieved at the cost of flexibility and volume. America, by contrast, had started with deeply flawed weapons produced by a peacetime bureaucracy more concerned with protecting reputations than winning wars. But once the flaws were identified and acknowledged, once the submarine commanders forced the issue through sheer persistence, the American industrial system had done what it did best: iterate, improve, and mass-produce. The same factories that had built fundamentally broken torpedoes in 1941 were producing reliable weapons in overwhelming quantities by 1944. Not perfect weapons, the T Mark the 13th remained temperamental compared to later designs, but functional ones. And in modern industrial warfare, functional weapons produced by the thousands beat perfect weapons produced by the hundreds. Nakamura thought about the intelligence briefings he'd attended back in 1942, where Japanese officers had laughed at American torpedo failures. That laughter now seemed like tragic hubris. They had been laughing at an enemy's stumble, not recognizing that the enemy was a giant who, once balanced, could not be stopped. The Americans had the luxury of failure because they had the industrial capacity to correct failure. They could produce 1,000 broken torpedoes, identify the problems, redesign the weapons, and produce 10,000 working ones, all while simultaneously building the submarines to carry them and the destroyers to protect their convoys and the aircraft carriers to control the seas. Japan had no such luxury. Every failure was permanent. Every loss was irreplaceable. The bitterness of this realization extended beyond simple military calculation. For officers like Nakamura, Men who had dedicated their lives to the Imperial Navy, who had believed absolutely in Japanese spiritual and technical superiority. The functional perfection of American torpedoes represented something more disturbing than tactical disadvantage. It represented the triumph of materialism over spirit, of industrial process over warrior excellence, of democratic capitalism over imperial will. It suggested that the entire philosophical foundation of Japanese militarism, the idea that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage, was simply wrong. There were stories circulating among submarine crews, stories that Nakamura tried to dismiss as defeatist rumors, but which contained the uncomfortable ring of truth. Stories of American submarines that would surface after sinking a Japanese transport and offer to take survivors aboard. An act of mercy unthinkable in the brutal calculus of submarine warfare. Stories of American prisoners who described submarine tenders equipped with ice cream machines and air conditioning, ships that seemed more like floating hotels than military vessels. Stories of American submarines returning from patrol with enough fuel and supplies remaining to continue operating, in stark contrast to Japanese boats that limped back to port running on fumes with starving crews. One story in particular haunted Nakamura. A Japanese destroyer captain who had survived his ship's sinking reported that the American submarine that torpedoed him had surfaced briefly afterward. Not to finish off survivors, the Americans had simply watched for a few minutes, apparently confirming the kill, then submerged and departed. But in those few minutes, the destroyer captain had seen something that shook him more than the combat itself. Through his binoculars, he'd glimpsed American sailors on the submarine's deck, and they had been eating. Not ration biscuits or preserved rice, but what appeared to be fresh sandwiches. The submarine had been at sea for weeks, and the crew was eating fresh food. The symbolic weight of that image. Enemy sailors, so well supplied they could afford to eat casually while survivors struggled in the water, had struck the destroyer captain as more demoralizing than any tactical defeat. These fragments of information, these glimpses of American abundance, accumulated like drops of water filling a vessel. Each one alone seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a picture of an enemy operating from a foundation of material wealth that Japan simply could not match. The working torpedoes were not an isolated technical achievement. They were a symptom of systemic industrial and organizational competence. The Americans had identified a problem, mobilized resources to solve it, implemented corrections across their entire submarine force, and resumed operations at increased lethality, all within the span of less than 2 years. That kind of systematic problem-solving required not just technical skill, but a culture of open communication, a willingness to acknowledge failure, and an industrial base capable of rapid, large-scale modification. Japan's military culture, by contrast, valued face-saving over problem-solving. When Japanese torpedoes failed, the institutional response was to blame commanders for poor tactics rather than engineers for poor design. When American industrial output exceeded Japanese estimates, the response was to question the statistics rather than adjust strategy. The same hierarchical rigidity that had made the Japanese military so effective in short, brutal campaigns of conquest had become a liability in a long war of industrial attrition. Problems were not solved, they were endured. And now, in the war's 4th year, the accumulated weight of unsolved problems was crushing. Standing on his submarine's bridge in the darkness, Nakamura felt the full weight of Imperial Japan's isolation. The I-58 was alone in hostile waters, hunting an enemy who controlled the seas, the skies, and, increasingly, the narrative of the war itself. The submarine's radio had picked up American broadcasts, propaganda certainly, but propaganda backed by undeniable facts. The Philippines were falling. Iwo Jima was being invaded. B-29 bombers were burning Japanese cities with impunity. And in the waters all around, American submarines, those boats that had once been laughably ineffective, were methodically severing every maritime connection that kept the Japanese war machine functioning. The philosophical implications were staggering. Japan had gone to war believing that spirit could triumph over material, that the warrior's will could overcome industrial disadvantage, that Asia could expel Western imperialism through superior resolve. The dysfunctional American torpedoes of 1941 and 1942 had seemed to validate that belief. Here was the decadent West, unable even to make its weapons function properly, surely vulnerable to a disciplined, spiritually superior foe. But the Americans had simply fixed their weapons and continued fighting. There had been no spiritual crisis, no loss of will. They had treated the torpedo problem like any other engineering challenge: identify, analyze, correct, implement. And now those corrected weapons were being used with devastating effectiveness by submarine crews who showed no signs of the war weariness that Japanese propaganda insisted must be crippling American morale. Nakamura had been taught at the Naval Academy that Americans were soft, that democracy made men weak, that a nation devoted to material comfort could not sustain the sacrifices necessary for victory. Yet here, in 1945, it was Japanese sailors who were starving, Japanese ships that lacked fuel, Japanese industry that was collapsing, while American submarines patrolled with full fuel tanks, full torpedo tubes, and well-fed crews. The propaganda had been exactly backward. Democracy, it turned out, was not weakness. It was the political system that allowed submarine commanders to challenge their own ordnance bureaus, that enabled organizational learning, that permitted the rapid correction of institutional failures. And material abundance, that supposed sign of decadence, was actually the foundation of sustained military effectiveness. The young sailors on the I-58 did not speak of these things directly. Military discipline forbade such dangerous thoughts. But Nakamura could see the doubt in their eyes, could feel it in the way they moved through their duties with mechanical compliance rather than zealous commitment. They were still loyal. They would still fight. But the absolute certainty that had animated the Imperial Navy in 1941 had been eroded by 4 years of cumulative defeat and increasing privation. The men knew they were starving while the enemy ate well. They knew their torpedoes often malfunctioned while American torpedoes hit their targets. They knew that going to sea meant increasingly not returning. What they did not know, what Nakamura himself was only beginning to suspect, was that the torpedo's transformation from American liability to American asset represented something more than a technical achievement. It represented the inevitable triumph of a particular kind of civilization. A civilization that could acknowledge failure without shame, that could reorganize and learn from mistakes, that possessed the industrial capacity to implement corrections at scale, and that fought wars not through spiritual exhortation, but through systematic problem-solving. The working American torpedo was not just a weapon. It was a message. We can fix what is broken. We can produce what is needed. We can learn faster than you can adapt. And we will not stop. In the pre-dawn darkness of January 17, 1945, as the I-58 prowled hostile waters on a mission that seemed increasingly futile, Nakamura made a decision he would not record in any log, would not speak aloud to any crew member. He decided to survive. Not for victory, he no longer believed victory was possible, but to witness and remember. Someone needed to understand what had happened, needed to recognize that this war had been lost not in any single battle, but in the foundational assumptions that had made the war seem winnable. Japan had bet everything on a short war, on spiritual superiority, on the enemy's supposed weakness. And when that bet failed, when the enemy proved neither weak nor easily discouraged, there had been no alternative strategy because the entire national ideology rejected the possibility of such failure. The American torpedo's journey from joke to juggernaut was a parable for the entire Pacific War. Both nations had started with flaws, but only one nation had possessed the institutional flexibility, the industrial capacity, and the cultural willingness to acknowledge and correct those flaws. The other nation, Nakamura's nation, had chosen to endure, to sacrifice, to demand ever greater exertions of will from ever more depleted resources. And now, in the war's final year, the price of that choice was becoming clear. Below deck, the torpedomen were conducting their routine maintenance, checking the ancient Type 92s that might or might not function when launched, rationing the depleted supply so that the I-58 could continue its mission a few more days, a few more miles. In the radio room, operators monitored frequencies full of American transmissions, so many transmissions that it seemed the enemy had a submarine or destroyer behind every wave. And in the engine room, artificers coaxed maximum efficiency from diesels that should have been overhauled months ago, but which had to keep running because there was no longer any safe port, any reliable supply, any realistic hope of relief. Nakamura turned his face into the salt wind, letting the cold spray sting his eyes. Somewhere out there in the darkness, American submarines were hunting. Their torpedoes, every single one, would hit their targets. They would not run too deep. They would not fail to detonate. They would not malfunction. They would simply work because the Americans had made them work. Because American industry and American culture had aligned to solve a problem that, in 1941, had seemed insuperable, and that, Nakamura understood, was the unbearable lesson of the working torpedo. Wars were not won by spirit alone. They were won by nations that could marry spirit to industrial competence, that could learn from failure, that could sustain both morale and material across years of grinding attrition. Japan had possessed the spirit but lacked the material. America had stumbled with the material but possessed the industrial and institutional capacity to correct course. And in modern warfare, in the kind of total, industrial, global war that the 20th century had made possible, that capacity for systematic correction was the difference between victory and annihilation. The sun would rise in an hour. The I-58 would dive and continue its patrol, hunting an enemy that controlled the seas through which it moved. The torpedoes in her tubes represented Japan's fading hope. Weapons that might work, that might find targets, that might achieve something against impossible odds. But Nakamura knew the truth that he could never speak aloud. The war had been decided not when Japan's best weapons failed, but when America's worst weapons were finally fixed. That moment, when the Mark 14 Domarns Brynnar torpedo began reliably hitting its targets, marked the point where Japanese tactical skill became irrelevant, where spiritual exhortations rang hollow, where the mathematical certainty of industrial attrition became the only truth that mattered. In the years after the war, when historians would analyze the American submarine campaign, they would cite statistics. Over 2,300 Japanese ships sunk, over 5 million tons of shipping destroyed, entire maritime routes severed. They would describe the American submarine force as the most effective per capita fighting unit in history. They would note that American submarines, comprising less than 2% of U.S. naval forces, sank over 55% of Japanese merchant tonnage. These numbers would tell a story of devastating effectiveness, but they would not fully capture the psychological dimension. The terrible moment when Japanese naval officers, men like Nakamura who had been trained to believe in their own superiority, realized that their enemy's dysfunctional weapons now worked, and that this technical correction represented something far more threatening than any tactical defeat. It represented the triumph of a different way of organizing human effort, a different relationship between individual and institution, a different understanding of how industrial societies wage war. The working American torpedo was not just a weapon. It was proof that democracy and abundance, those things Japanese militarists had dismissed as weakness, were actually sources of strength in total war. It was demonstration that systematic problem-solving beat spiritual exhortation. It was evidence that industrial production at scale, even when initially flawed, ultimately beat artisanal perfection produced in limited quantities. And most devastatingly, it was confirmation that Japan had misunderstood the enemy from the beginning, had mistaken flexibility for weakness, had confused self-criticism for defeatism, had dismissed industrial abundance as decadence, rather than recognizing it as the foundation of sustainable military power. As morning light began to gray the eastern horizon, Nakamura gave the order to dive. The I-58 slipped beneath the waves, descending into the relative safety of the depths, where the only sound was the submarine's own machinery and the endless, patient creaking of the pressure hull. But there was no safety. Not really. Somewhere above, American submarines were hunting with working torpedoes. Somewhere in Japanese naval headquarters, officers were planning operations with resources that no longer existed. Somewhere in Tokyo, leaders were exhorting the people to greater sacrifice for a victory that was no longer possible. And somewhere in the cold mathematics of industrial warfare, the simple fact of working American torpedoes, every single one, was writing the Pacific War's final chapter. Not through any single dramatic battle, but through the cumulative, relentless, systematic destruction of everything that allowed an island empire to sustain itself. One reliable torpedo at a time, one sunken transport at a time, one severed supply line at a time, until nothing remained but memory, and the bitter understanding that this had always been inevitable once the Americans learned to make their weapons work. The lesson was simple, brutal, and complete. In industrial warfare, the side that can systematically identify and correct its own failures will defeat the side that cannot, regardless of initial advantages in skill, spirit, or tactical doctrine. The working torpedo was not aberration, it was inevitability. And Japan, having bet everything on the enemy's permanent dysfunction, had no response when that dysfunction was methodically corrected. Nakamura would survive the war. The I-58 would eventually return to port, would surrender along with the rest of the Imperial Navy, would be scuttled by occupation forces. And in the decades that followed, in the quiet moments when old submariners gathered to remember, they would speak of many things, of comrades lost, of battles fought, of the Emperor's surrender. But underlying all those memories was one uncomfortable truth they rarely voiced. The moment they truly understood the war was lost was not when the bombs fell on Hiroshima, not when the Soviets invaded Manchuria, but earlier, in those cold months of late 1944 and early 1945, when the intelligence reports made it clear that American torpedoes, every single one, were finally hitting their targets. That was when they knew. That was when the ocean itself seemed to turn against them. That was when the war became not a contest of wills, but a mathematical progression toward certain defeat. The working torpedo, the systematic correction, the industrial triumph, and in that triumph, the final, irrefutable proof that Japan had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare and the character of the enemy it had chosen to fight.